She woke up in a soaking wet coat that didn't belong to her, with no idea who she was or where she'd been. There was no wallet, no ID, no phone, just a German shepherd staring like he had followed her through fire and time itself. A folded photograph in her hand showed her smiling beside the dog, with 5 haunting words written on the back in fading ink. Every town she passes through unlocks another chilling piece of a life she doesn't recognize, but everyone else insists was hers. A veteran says she saved his life in war, a waitress claims she vanished during a storm, and a child swears she once lived in their house. But nothing explains why her husband still waits at the train station every single day, holding her favorite pie and a thermos of coffee. The closer she gets to the truth, the louder her nightmares become, like someone, somewhere, doesn't want her to remember who she truly is. And the day she finally steps off the last train, one look into his eyes unearths a memory so violent she can barely stand. Because the man who waited all those years with love in his heart, is also the man she once ran from in fear. And now she has to remember why. Martha, the woman who lost her memory, couldn't yet know that Evelyn had been quietly following her trail across 4 different towns for almost a year. Thomas, the husband who waited without letters or photographs, had no idea that the sister Martha once thought she never had was the one leaving notes behind every time she vanished. Ranger, the German shepherd trained to lead, not follow, certainly had no idea that the cabin he brought her to was built with money Evelyn saved from a life they should have shared. It all started with the sound of rain tapping gently on the corrugated metal roof of a forgotten roadside shelter, the kind you don't notice until you need it, and by then, it's already too late to ask how you got there. There was no name on her lips, no purse on her lap, no memory gently nudging her awake, only the wet sleeves of a coat far too large for her shoulders and the focused, patient gaze of a German shepherd sitting 3 feet away, as if guarding something sacred. She didn't speak, and neither did he, but there was something in the way he tilted his head that made her feel, perhaps for the first time in hours, or was it days, that she wasn't entirely alone. And in her hand, wrinkled and damp, was a key with a plastic tag that read, Fern Creek Cabin Number 3, along with a folded postcard bearing 5 shaky words, You were always the map. The rain didn't stop, but she stood up anyway, boots squeaking, legs unsteady like a newborn fawn. She looked around the empty lot, surrounded by pine trees and a road that stretched in both directions without signposts, just fog, silence, and the gentle rhythm of rainfall that felt too familiar not to mean something. The dog, without command or hesitation, turned and began walking down the road, occasionally glancing back, as if to say, Come on, we've done this before. And though she didn't know where she was going, or why, she followed him, her hand clutching the key like it was the only truth left in her world. They walked until the light changed, the fog lifting just enough to reveal a wooden sign with chipped paint, Fern Creek Cabins, Private. There were 7 cabins, each tucked between whispering trees, and the third one had a rusted doorknob and a faded porch swing swaying gently in the wind, as if someone had just left. She placed the key in the lock, and to her quiet disbelief, it turned without resistance, the door creaking open to reveal the faint scent of cedarwood, old coffee, and lemon polish. Inside, nothing screamed her name, but everything whispered a memory, a worn quilt on the bed, a framed sketch of a lake, and a chipped mug on the windowsill labeled M. She wandered through the small space like a ghost tracing someone else's steps, brushing her fingers over books she didn't remember reading and a pair of knitting needles stuck through a half-finished scarf she might have started long ago. The dog circled once, then lay down near the fireplace, resting his head on crossed paws, as if settling into a rhythm he knew well. In a drawer beside the bed, she found a yellowed envelope labeled, If You Forget Again. Inside was a note written in her own hand. Your name is Martha Ellison. You're safe. You are not broken. Keep walking. You'll find him again. And just like that, the first tear fell, soft, hesitant, as if unsure whether to trust the moment. She sat down on the edge of the bed, letter in hand, dog at her feet, and whispered the name aloud as if testing its weight. Martha. But it still didn't feel like hers. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and a beam of pale light slid through the clouds, striking the lake in the distance like a silver coin tossed into a wishing well. She turned to Ranger, who lifted his head just slightly, alert, waiting. "Where do we go now?" she asked, not expecting an answer. "You came from Fern Creek," the man behind the gas station counter asked in the next town. "That cabin's been empty for over a year. But someone keeps leaving food out for a dog like that. You sure you weren't there before?" The man's voice had that dry, leathery quality you only hear in folks who've lived long enough to measure time not by clocks, but by seasons, harvests, and loss. He didn't speak with suspicion, but with the careful curiosity of someone who's seen enough strange things in his life to know when not to ask too much, and yet, too human to keep quiet altogether. Martha stood there, the hem of her coat still damp from the walk, her hands wrapped around a cup of gas station coffee so hot and bitter it almost felt like an anchor, pulling her toward the present. She looked at him, his wind-creased eyes, the flannel shirt worn down at the collar, the name tag that said Dale and nothing more, and opened her mouth, but no answer came, just the taste of confusion and old fear on the back of her tongue. I don't remember," she said finally, her voice quieter than she expected, like it had aged faster than the rest of her. Ranger, who had followed her in with calm certainty, now sat squarely by the doorway, his eyes fixed on Dale like he was listening for something no one else could hear. The man leaned over the counter, squinting toward the dog, then nodded slowly, as though just now connecting a puzzle piece he didn't realize was missing. "That dog's been comin' into town alone for months now," he said, his thumb tapping the counter once. "Walks up the road like he knows where he's going, stands right here at the door, waits till someone puts out food, then walks back into the woods like he's got a place to be." Martha tightened her grip on the coffee, the warmth seeping through her gloves and into her aching knuckles, as if trying to chase away a cold that had started somewhere much deeper than her skin. She sat down on a faded plastic chair by the window, facing the quiet road that disappeared into the gray line of the forest, and felt, for a moment, like maybe she'd walked this road before, maybe not once, but dozens of times, always forgetting why, always searching for something just out of reach. Dale came around the counter and lowered himself into the creaking chair across from her, placing a biscuit on a paper towel and setting it carefully at Ranger's feet, as if he'd done it many times before. "You don't look like the kind of lady who just ends up in the woods by accident," he said slowly, choosing each word like it might break. "And that cabin, you sure that wasn't yours? You had the key, didn't you?" She looked down at the key again, still in her pocket, still real, still cold like a truth she hadn't earned. "I don't know if it's mine," she said, her voice steady now but unsure. "But there was a quilt on the bed. It looked like something I would have made." And then, as if pulled from a place deep in her chest, she added, "I think I've lost something. Or someone." Dale's expression softened in that quiet, reverent way men get when they know pain but respect its privacy. He reached behind the counter and pulled out a cardboard box with curled edges and a layer of dust that spoke of waiting. "Had a lady leave this here a while back," he said. "She came through on foot. Didn't speak much. Asked to leave it in case someone came looking. She said they might not remember their name, but they'd recognize the box." Martha hesitated, heart thumping now, not from fear, but from something older, quieter, more tangled. The box was nothing remarkable, just brown cardboard sealed with red twine, a little uneven, like it was tied by nervous hands. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling not from age, but from the weight of what might be inside. Inside was a worn paperback book with yellowed pages and a cracked spine, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, its cover soft from repeated handling. Folded inside the front cover was a torn piece of map with one small dot circled in red and a scribbled note. "If she forgets again, take her to where the trees meet the river. She'll remember." Beneath the book was a photograph, grainy, faded, but unmistakable. It showed her, younger, hair longer, laughing at something off camera. Beside her sat the same German shepherd, just a little leaner, a little younger, his tongue hanging out in joy. In the background, a wooden cabin with a porch swing and a cluster of pine trees catching the light just so. She pressed the photo to her chest, not crying, not yet, but something inside her cracked open, like a frozen creek in early spring, beginning to stir. She turned to Dale, whose eyes had never left her face. "Where is this place?" she asked, her voice steadier now, almost hungry. "Where the trees meet the river." Dale leaned back, scratching his jaw, his eyes flicking to the window like he could already see it there. "You follow the road west, till you see the old wooden cross stuck in the ground," he said. "After that, take the dirt path north, there's only one bend in it, and keep going until you hear the water." He stood slowly, walking back to the counter, his step stiff but sure. "And when you get there," he added without looking back, "tell Lila she still owes me a jar of those pickled onions she used to make." Martha blinked. "Lila?" she repeated, barely above a whisper. "She said you'd remember her name before you remembered your own," Dale had said, never once turning to see how her hands trembled when he spoke the word Lila. And now, as the late afternoon sun stretched across the narrow country road, Martha walked slowly, one step after another, following the whisper of water she hadn't yet heard, but somehow expected. The road stretched ahead like a forgotten thought, lined with tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze, their branches brushing against the sky as if waving her forward with a kind of solemn encouragement. There was something about the way the shadows filtered through the trees, how the sunlight flickered like memory itself, sometimes bright and sure, other times soft and flickering, always just on the edge of vanishing. She didn't speak to Ranger as they walked, but she didn't need to. The dog moved with quiet purpose, pausing now and then to sniff the air or glance back, like a trail guide from a life she used to know. Her shoes, still wet from the morning's rain, left faint impressions in the sandy dirt, but she didn't mind the squish or the cold anymore. It was grounding, in a world where almost nothing else was. And then, just as Dale had said, the wooden cross appeared, tilted slightly to one side, its white paint long since worn away by time and weather, but still standing, like some forgotten marker in a story only a few people could still tell. She paused there for a moment, laying a hand gently on its splintered surface, feeling something stir in her chest, not recognition exactly, but something softer, like the memory of a lullaby hummed through a half-open door. Ranger nudged her leg gently with his snout, as if reminding her there was still more to see, still more of the thread to follow. So she turned on to the narrow path veering north, and as she walked deeper into the trees, the silence around her began to change, not vanish, but evolve, becoming fuller, rounder, filled with the faint murmur of running water. When she finally reached the bend in the path, the trees opened like curtains, revealing a wide, shallow river glittering with early evening light, its banks scattered with smooth stones and thick moss that held the scent of rain and pine. And there, nestled among the trees, stood a small wooden cottage with smoke curling lazily from its chimney, the kind of smoke that smelled like cedar and cinnamon and safety. Ranger ran ahead without hesitation, his paws crunching softly on the path, and Martha followed him, her heart picking up pace as if something inside her recognized the place even though her mind still struggled to grasp why. As she approached the porch, the door creaked open, and a woman stepped into the doorway, a sturdy woman with silver-streaked hair tied in a thick braid and a long cotton apron covered in flour. She didn't look surprised to see Martha. In fact, she smiled as though she'd been expecting this visit for a very long time. "You've come farther than I thought you would," the woman said, her voice low and warm like a fire that had just been stoked. Martha opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came, so the woman stepped down from the porch and wrapped her in a gentle, steady embrace, one arm around her back, the other cradling the side of her head like a mother would. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "I've got a pie in the oven, and you always remembered things better over pie." They sat on the porch together, side by side, the silence between them no longer empty but full of old familiarity and patient waiting. The woman introduced herself only once, with a smile that reached her eyes. "I'm Lila, honey. And you're Martha Ellison. But you used to call me Birdie." Martha turned toward her slowly, eyebrows knitting together as a slow warmth crept through her chest. "Birdie," she repeated, the word foreign and familiar all at once. Lila nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "You started calling me that after I broke my arm trying to climb that apple tree when we were kids." Said I looked like a baby bird fallen from the nest. The words landed with a strange kind of weight, not heavy with pain but saturated with something deeper, a sense of shared history she couldn't yet reach, but could suddenly feel the shape of. You said I was your favorite cousin, Lila continued, even after you left and couldn't come back. Martha flinched, the words ringing in her ears like an echo from inside a cave she hadn't yet dared enter. I left? She asked, barely above a whisper, as the sun dipped below the trees and painted the porch in gold and shadow. Lila looked at her for a long moment, then turned toward the screen door. I'll answer that, she said softly, but first, I want to show you something you made, something you left behind. She rose from the porch swing and disappeared into the house, leaving the door gently swinging open behind her, letting out the warm scent of cinnamon and something savory. Martha sat in silence, her fingers resting on the edge of the old wood rail, her pulse steady now, slower than it had been all day, but still uncertain. Lila returned holding something wrapped in cloth, blue linen, worn at the edges, tied with a piece of old yarn. She handed it to Martha without a word, and when the cloth fell away, Martha saw a leather-bound journal, hand-stitched, the cover etched with faint floral designs. On the first page, written in looping handwriting that she somehow knew was her own, were the words. For when I forget again. Please remind me, I chose to leave for love. The breath caught in her throat like a held note at the end of a hymn. She looked up at Lila, who met her eyes with the kind of sadness that had long since turned into grace. Why would I write that? Martha asked, voice shaking now, not from fear, but from the possibility of answers. Because the man you left was the only one who ever waited for you to come home, Lila had said, her voice quieter than the wind rustling through the pine trees beyond the porch. And now, as the firelight inside cast long, soft shadows on the cabin walls, Martha held the leather journal against her chest like it might whisper something she'd forgotten how to hear. The journal was heavier than it looked, not just in weight, but in the kind of quiet burden that lives in objects touched by grief, by memory, and by hands that trembled when they wrote the truth. She hadn't opened it past that first page, not yet. There was a part of her afraid that too much light all at once might blind her completely, and some part of her still needed the dark. Ranger lay curled at her feet by the fireplace, his ears flicking every now and then toward some sound only he could interpret, but his body calm, steady, as though he recognized this place and understood what it meant. Lila poured them both mugs of chamomile tea, the kind with honey already stirred in, not too sweet, not too strong, just right, like the comfort of a front porch swing in the early morning before the world wakes up. She handed Martha her mug without saying a word, the silence between them so natural it felt like a continuation of a conversation they'd once started a lifetime ago and never quite finished. Martha took a sip, her hands warming around the cup, her eyes drifting to the windows where the trees swayed gently under a sky full of stars that blinked like tiny promises. I still don't know who he was, she finally said, her voice soft but steady now, like an old song remembered after years of silence. The man I left, the one who waited. Was he my husband? Lila didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up and walked to the far wall of the cabin, the one lined with old books and mason jars filled with buttons, ribbons, and carefully labeled seeds. With practiced hands, she reached behind the lowest shelf and pressed gently on one of the wall panels, revealing a small wooden compartment hidden in the grain. From inside, she pulled out a narrow envelope, worn at the corners, yellowed with time, but still sealed. Without a word, she handed it to Martha and returned to her chair, folding her hands in her lap like she'd rehearsed this moment in her mind for years and knew there was nothing more to say. Martha turned the envelope over in her fingers slowly, noting how the name on the front, M. Ellison, was written in careful, deliberate handwriting, the kind a man might use when he's afraid the woman he loves won't recognize it anymore. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet room, like the turning of a page that had been waiting too long to be read. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, with a soft indentation from where it had been pressed against something else for many years. She unfolded it slowly and began to read. Martha, if you're reading this, then somehow you found your way back. Maybe it was Ranger who brought you. Maybe it was the map we drew together, long ago, the one no one else ever saw but us. Maybe it was just time. But wherever you've been, and however long it's been, please know this, I never stopped waiting. Not once. Her breath caught halfway through the page, and her fingers moved to her lips, as though trying to trap the sob before it could escape. The words continued. I don't blame you for forgetting. I don't. After we lost her, something broke in both of us, but you carried the weight alone. I saw it every morning in your eyes. You didn't run because you stopped loving me, you ran because you loved her too much. And when memory became a burden, you set it down the only way you knew how. I understood that. And I forgave you before you ever left. Martha set the letter in her lap and leaned back, her eyes staring at the ceiling as if she might find some piece of the sky through the wood, some window into the past. She didn't know who her was, not yet, but the ache in her chest told her the loss had once been everything. She turned back to Lila, whose eyes had grown misty but whose expression held only kindness. Was it a child? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the soft crackle of the fire. Lila's eyes dropped to her lap, and she nodded once, slow and heavy, as though even now the truth carried more weight than words could bear. Her name was Katie, she said, each syllable like a candle lit for a soul long gone but never forgotten. She was your daughter. And mine, too, in a way. Martha's head snapped up at that, confusion washing over her in cold waves. Yours? She asked, the word catching in her throat like a thorn. Lila looked at her then, not with pain, but with something deeper, compassion shaped by time, softened by memory, and polished by sorrow. You took me in after my sister passed, she said softly, when I had no one else. You raised me like your own. And Katie, she called us both Mama sometimes. Just to tease. You always let her. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was filled with the hum of grief that had nowhere to go but deeper into the heart. And for the first time, Martha allowed the tears to fall without trying to understand them, without needing a reason or an answer. She looked down at Ranger, who had not moved, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed like he'd known this story all along. She reached for the journal again and flipped through the pages, not to read yet, but simply to feel their weight, to know it was real, that something of her had been here before. Outside, the wind shifted, and the trees rustled like voices speaking from long ago, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called once and then fell silent. Martha turned to Lila, her voice steadier now, like a river settling after the storm. What happened to him? She asked, and though she didn't say his name, they both knew who she meant. He stayed, Lila had said, her voice so quiet it almost disappeared into the soft crackling of the fire beside them. He never left the house by the lake, not even once. He said you'd find your way back, someday. The road from Lila's cabin to the lake was long and winding, the kind of road that made you question whether you were still going the right way, even when every turn felt vaguely familiar in a way that tugged at something buried deep beneath the surface of knowing. Martha sat in the passenger seat of Lila's old station wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the leather journal pressed between her knees like a fragile heirloom, while Ranger lay curled behind them in the back seat, his steady breathing the only sound in the otherwise reverent quiet. The sun hung low in the sky, casting that late afternoon glow where everything seemed golden and forgiving, as though the day itself understood that some journeys take longer than others, not just in miles, but in memory and grace. Neither woman spoke as the trees thinned and the winding path gave way to a clearing where the lake opened up before them, still and wide, its surface catching the light like a memory just barely recalled. There, at the water's edge, stood a small white house with a blue roof and a porch that sagged gently in the middle, the swing on one end swaying ever so slightly, though there was no breeze strong enough to move it. Martha stepped out of the car slowly, her legs stiff, but her heart moving faster than it had in days, perhaps weeks, though she couldn't say why, only that something inside her was leaning forward now, like a flower turning toward the light. The walk up to the porch felt longer than it should have, as if the ground itself was remembering the weight of her footsteps after so many years. And when she reached the first step, Ranger darted ahead of her, leaping up with an energy she hadn't seen since Fern Creek, scratching gently at the front door like he knew exactly who would be on the other side. Before Martha could knock, or even breathe, the door creaked open from within, and a man appeared in the frame. He was older than the version of him she carried in the shadowy corners of her mind, his hair more silver than dark, his shoulders narrower, but his eyes. His eyes were the same, blue-gray like storm clouds that never quite broke, steady and unblinking, but impossibly gentle. He didn't speak right away, didn't reach out or even smile, he simply looked at her like he'd done it every day for the last 10 years, as if her face, even in its silence and confusion, was the most familiar thing in the world. Ranger sat at his feet and leaned against the man's leg like he was claiming something lost, and the man placed a hand on the dog's head without looking down, his gaze never leaving Martha's. "I wasn't sure what I'd say when this moment came," the man said finally, his voice rough like gravel underfoot, but kind all the same. "But it turns out I don't have to say much at all." Martha's throat tightened as if her body had suddenly remembered how to cry, though the tears hadn't yet come. "I don't know who you are," she said softly, every word an apology she didn't know how to fix. "But something about you, something feels like Sunday mornings. Like the smell of toast and wet leaves." He smiled then, small, careful, like a man trying not to scare away a dream. "I'm Thomas," he said, voice steady now. "I'm your husband, Martha. And this is still your home, if you want it to be." She took a breath that felt heavier than it should have, and yet so light it might float away if she didn't hold on to it. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and touched the edge of the porch railing, brushing her fingers over a spot worn smooth, where 100 cups of coffee might have been set down over the years. He stepped aside without another word, letting the screen door fall open gently, inviting her in not with insistence, but with the patience of someone who understood that love, real love, waits without conditions. The inside of the house was warm, full of the quiet scent of rosemary and wood smoke and something sweet cooling on the counter. The walls were lined with photographs, some framed neatly, some tacked on with yellowing tape, all of them filled with faces she couldn't yet name but felt drawn to, as if her heart recognized what her mind had forgotten. She paused before one frame in particular, a picture of a little girl in denim overalls, missing her 2 front teeth, with a paint-smeared grin and eyes that matched her own. Beside her stood Thomas, a younger Thomas, his hand resting protectively on the girl's shoulder, both of them looking at whoever held the camera with the kind of happiness you can't fake, even if you tried. "Her name was Katie," Thomas said from behind her, his voice quieter now, like he was standing inside a chapel. "You named her after your grandmother. You used to say she had her laugh." Martha closed her eyes and leaned a hand on the wall beside the photo, not because she felt faint, but because something inside her felt too big to carry upright. "I remember her laugh," she said slowly, the words tasting like rain after a long drought. "Like little bells. Like something too light to ever fall." Thomas nodded, walking past her to the kitchen, where he poured her a cup of coffee and set it on the table by the window, beside a folded newspaper and a vase with a single sprig of lavender. "I make coffee the same way you used to," he said, smiling gently. "Too much cream, too little sugar. Took me years to get it wrong just the way you liked it." Martha chuckled then, softly, and the sound surprised even her. It wasn't forced, and it didn't come from her lips alone, but from somewhere deeper, like the sound had been waiting for its chance to rise again. She walked to the table and sat, wrapping her hands around the mug as though it were something sacred, something that might help her remember the parts of herself that were still just out of reach. As the silence stretched between them once more, comfortable now, not heavy, her eyes drifted to the lake through the window, where the water moved in slow, steady circles. The kind of circles that never end, that fold into themselves again and again, each ripple another step in a journey that leads right back to where it began. "I think I want to remember all of it," she said finally, looking back at Thomas with quiet resolve. "Not just the parts that feel safe." "Then are you ready to see what you left behind in the attic?" Thomas had asked, his hand resting gently on Martha's shoulder. And though the question was simple, the weight behind it filled the room like a hush before a hymn. They climbed the stairs slowly, not because her body protested the motion, though it did, in quiet, familiar ways, but because something about the moment felt too delicate to be rushed, like a memory that might vanish if you reached for it too quickly. The narrow wooden staircase creaked beneath their steps, each board offering its own small protest, as if the house itself was aware of the history being revisited and wasn't quite sure it was ready either. At the top, the hallway narrowed into a slanted corridor, where the ceiling dropped low and the light faded into the kind of soft gloom that only ever existed in old homes and older hearts. Thomas reached up and pulled the cord that dangled from the ceiling, and the attic ladder creaked down with the dusty sigh of forgotten years being summoned from their long, patient sleep. He turned to her, eyes searching hers not for certainty, because he knew there was none to be found, but for courage, even the smallest trace of it. Martha took the first step onto the ladder with a breath that felt like the kind you take before walking into a room where someone you love is waiting, even when you're not sure they'll still recognize you. Ranger remained at the bottom of the stairs, his body still, ears alert, as though he understood that this part of the journey belonged to her alone. The attic was cool and dim, with only one small circular window letting in the pale light of early evening, dust particles dancing like quiet ghosts across the beams. Boxes lined the far wall, some labeled in her handwriting, others marked with vague phrases like, keep, or old books, or simply, Katie. She moved slowly, fingers brushing over the tops of the boxes like they were familiar faces in a crowd, until one stopped her hand, a small wooden trunk, the kind children used to hide their most precious things in. She knelt beside it, the motion stiff but steady, and opened the lid with a quiet reverence that felt almost sacred. Inside was a red ribbon, frayed at the edges, the kind used in school Christmas plays, a handful of seashells painted with glitter and initials, a folded drawing of a house with stick figures holding hands in front of it, one of them labeled, me, the others, Mom, and Dad. Martha stared at the drawing, her breath catching, her hand lifting to her lips as if to hold in the sound of something breaking open. She hadn't remembered the drawing itself, not yet, but the feeling it gave her, the warmth of tiny fingers pressed into hers, the weight of a sleepy head on her shoulder, the rhythm of a child's laughter echoing through rooms now too quiet, was undeniable. Beneath the drawing lay a small, cloth-bound diary, the pages worn and soft, filled with Katie's looping, misspelled words, childish and pure. She opened to a random page and read. Today we made cookies but Mom burned them. Dad said they were perfectly toasted and then we all laughed so hard. I like when Mom laughs. I think that's what makes the house feel full. Martha closed the diary slowly, not to shut the memory away again, but to hold it steady before it overwhelmed her. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the next box, this one marked in her own handwriting, letters I never sent. She opened it gently, revealing dozens of envelopes, none of them sealed, each one addressed only with a date, as if the act of writing had been more important than the act of delivering. She pulled one out, dated 3 months after the loss, after Katie had gone, and began to read aloud, her voice soft, unsteady, but stronger with every word. Thomas, today I stood in her room for the first time since the morning we left for the hospital. The sheets still smelled like her shampoo. I tried to fold them, but my hands wouldn't work right. I'm sorry I couldn't talk at dinner. I didn't know how to speak when everything inside me felt gone. She lowered the letter and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, surprised to find it wet, though not ashamed. The attic was quiet, but the silence wasn't cold anymore, it was full, pulsing with everything unsaid, everything remembered. Thomas had climbed the ladder by then and stood beside her, not touching, not crowding, just being there the way only someone who had shared your grief could be. Martha turned to him, her voice low but clear, a thread pulled taut between pain and healing. Why didn't you come looking for me? She asked, not accusing, not pleading, just wondering, from the soft center of a heart trying to understand. Because chasing you would have meant forcing you to remember, Thomas had said, his voice hushed with the gentleness of earned patience. And I knew that when you were ready, you'd come home on your own. That night, sleep did not come easily to Martha, not because she was restless or afraid, but because her mind had started remembering more than it had in years, and now the silence of the house seemed thick with echoes of things she couldn't yet place. The bedroom, still painted a soft blue with white curtains that moved gently in the breeze, carried the faint scent of lavender and thyme, like it had been waiting not just for a person, but for peace to return. She lay beneath a faded quilt she must have sewn long ago, patches of old dresses, picnic cloths, and baby blankets stitched together with hands that once knew how to make beauty out of sorrow. Ranger curled up beside the bed without being asked, his steady presence reminding her that even when the mind forgets, the heart remembers what it needs to survive. In the early morning, just after the first birds began calling softly from the trees beyond the lake, Martha rose quietly and stood by the window, the hem of her robe brushing the tops of her bare feet. She stared out across the yard, past the old tire swing and the rusted watering can, toward the gravel road that disappeared into the trees, and for just a moment, she saw a woman standing there. The woman was tall and thin, dressed in a brown coat with a red scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her face turned upward as if searching for something just above the horizon. Martha blinked once, and the woman was gone, but the strange feeling remained, like the tail end of a dream that followed her into the morning. She dressed slowly and went downstairs, where Thomas stood at the stove cooking eggs and bacon with the quiet ease of someone who'd learned long ago how to make silence feel like home. They ate without speaking, the clink of forks and the soft hum of the refrigerator providing all the conversation they needed, until Martha finally set her fork down and asked, "Did someone else ever come here, after I left?" Thomas didn't look surprised by the question. In fact, he nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a towel before sitting across from her, his gaze calm but weighted with memory. "There was a woman who came once," he said carefully, "a little more than a year ago. She didn't give her name, but she said she was your friend." Martha tilted her head, a slight crease forming between her eyebrows. "I don't remember anyone coming to the cabin," she said softly. "I mean, the cabin at Fern Creek. I thought I'd been alone all that time." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming softly on the edge of the table, as though thinking not just about what to say, but about how to say it in a way that wouldn't send her retreating back into the fog of unknowing. "She told me you'd been staying off and on in a little place behind the library in Holbrook," he said at last, his eyes searching hers. "She said you were different, quiet, forgetful, but still you. Still kind. Still gentle." Martha's breath caught again, as it so often had these past few days, the sensation no longer frightening but strangely familiar, like her body was slowly relearning how to hold grief and joy at the same time. "Holbrook," she repeated, the name like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the quiet of her mind. "I think I used to go there as a child. There was a window in the children's room. I remember sitting beside it and reading on rainy afternoons." Thomas nodded, that same patient smile just barely touching the corners of his mouth. "Well, that's where she said she found you," he replied. "She said you always came in just before closing, and you'd sit by that same window, never checking out a book, never speaking unless spoken to, but always there, like a habit your soul refused to let go of." Martha rose from her chair slowly, her fingers trailing across the back of it as she moved toward the window once more. "I need to go there," she said, the words quiet but sure, like they'd already been decided in some part of her long before she said them aloud. "I think there's something I left behind. Or something someone else left for me." Later that afternoon, with the sun high in the sky and the road dry and clear, Thomas helped her pack a small bag while Ranger leapt into the back seat with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog. They drove for almost an hour, winding through narrow country roads and wide open stretches of farmland, until the little town of Holbrook appeared on the horizon like an old friend who'd never stopped waiting for her to come back. The library was exactly as she remembered, red brick, ivy climbing the left side, and a white bell tower that hadn't rung in years but still stood tall against the sky. Inside, the scent of old books and lemon oil welcomed her like a memory she didn't know she missed. The children's room was tucked in the back corner, just past the reference section and beneath a stained glass skylight that bathed everything below in soft, colored light. And there, by the window, was a wooden chair with a small brass plaque nailed into its back. She leaned in to read the words, her breath catching as her eyes moved slowly across the inscription. "Reserved for M. Ellison. May she always find her way home through the pages. Beside the chair, on the windowsill, lay a worn, cloth-bound book, Little Women, its pages bookmarked with a red ribbon, frayed at the edges, just like the one from the attic trunk. She picked it up, fingers trembling, and opened to the marked page. Written in careful, looping script on the inside cover was a note. You may forget where you've been, but the people who love you never stop leaving signs in case you find your way back. Martha turned to Thomas, her eyes wide now, not with fear but with the wonder of a heart rediscovering its place in the world. Who wrote this? She whispered, voice barely rising above the quiet rustle of pages around them. The woman who left that for you, Thomas had said gently, his voice laced with something between awe and sorrow. Said she was your sister. Martha stood in the library's soft, filtered light for a long time, her fingers still resting on the book's fabric cover, the red ribbon trailing over her hand like a lifeline made of memory. The word sister echoed in her chest not like a bell tolling loudly, but more like a low hum carried on the wind, familiar in a way that stirred something older than thought, something deeper than language itself. She turned slowly, her gaze lingering on the chair beneath the stained glass skylight, the brass plaque glinting gently like a quiet promise kept, even when the world had forgotten it needed one. Thomas stood a few steps away, hands folded gently in front of him, waiting not for questions or reactions, but simply waiting the way he always had, with the kind of stillness that doesn't rush healing, but makes room for it to unfold. I didn't have a sister, Martha said quietly, though her voice wavered at the end, betraying her uncertainty not in what she knew, but in what she could no longer trust herself to know. Thomas didn't flinch or argue, instead, he stepped closer and offered her something far more valuable than certainty, his presence, steady and calm, like a porch light left on through a long, stormy night. She told me the two of you were raised apart, he said slowly, as if each word had to travel a long distance before being spoken aloud. Said your parents had given her up before you were born, that she spent most of her life searching for answers she couldn't find until she found you. Martha stared out the window for a moment, watching as two children played in the grass beyond the parking lot, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass, piercing and sweet. It was strange, she thought, how life gave us pieces of ourselves through others, through strangers, through books, through dogs who refused to leave us behind. She said her name was Evelyn, Thomas continued, his voice dipping lower, gentler now, like a man lowering a letter into the grave of someone he'd never stopped praying for. She came here every Tuesday for 3 years, always right before closing. She never stayed long. She always sat in that chair. Martha turned her gaze back to the ribbon and the worn book, and then, almost without thinking, she reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against something she hadn't realized was there until now. She pulled it out slowly, a small photograph, slightly bent at the corners, showing two young women sitting side by side on a picnic blanket, both smiling wide with eyes too similar to be coincidence. It was tucked between the pages of the journal she had carried with her since Fern Creek, a journal she hadn't opened beyond the first page, afraid of what she might find, and what she might not. She handed the photo to Thomas without a word, and he took it gently, studying it with a quiet reverence that felt more like prayer than observation. That's her, he said finally, his thumb brushing the corner of the photo. That's Evelyn. She brought that picture to me the first time she came to the house. Asked if I knew where you were. Martha sat down on the small bench near the window, the afternoon light curling around her shoulders like a shawl woven from the past. She felt no fear, no panic, only the slow rise of emotion so old it had lost its name, surfacing now like a letter floating up through deep, still water. She was trying to reach me, Martha whispered, more to herself than to him. Even when I wasn't fully me anymore, she still came looking. Thomas nodded once, slowly. She said she wasn't trying to remind you of anything. She just wanted you to know that you were loved, even if you didn't remember how. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman with silver curls and a name tag that simply read, Dorothy, appeared from the far side of the room, holding a small envelope in her hand. I didn't mean to interrupt, she said gently, her voice warm like honey on toast. But I found this in our safe. She asked us to give it to you, when you came back. Martha took the envelope carefully, her fingers trembling not from age, but from the fragile anticipation that comes only once in a lifetime, the moment you realize someone you never knew had spent years loving you from afar. She opened it slowly, savoring the quiet as though the silence itself had waited alongside the paper all this time. Inside was a single page, written in ink that had faded just slightly, as if it had been held often, perhaps reread a dozen times by the person who had sealed it with so much hope. Martha, if you found this, then I've already gone home. I hope I had time to meet your eyes again. I hope you remembered enough to smile. I don't blame you for forgetting. Life has a way of overwhelming the parts of us that most deserve protecting. I just want you to know that I remembered for both of us. I left pieces of you wherever I could, so you could follow the breadcrumbs back to yourself. You were always worth the journey. Love always, Evelyn. Martha pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, not to block out the world, but to hold it closer for a while, to let it settle in a place that had long needed filling. For the first time since her return, she felt something shift, not a memory regained, but a space reopened, a door creaked ajar in her spirit, not her mind. As they walked slowly back to the car, Ranger trailing behind with the tired satisfaction of a guide nearing the end of a long, faithful route, Martha turned to Thomas once more. Her voice was quieter now, not because it was weak, but because the truth she carried was finally heavy enough to carry with grace. If Evelyn remembered for both of us, she said, what else did she leave behind? She left you something in the diner where your story almost ended, Thomas had said quietly. The place where your memory broke for the last time. They didn't rush the drive, because something about long stretches of open road and tall trees on either side seemed to ask for silence and reflection, like the road itself understood that time was not just something you measure in minutes, but something you carry, mile by mile, story by story, heart by heart. Martha sat in the passenger seat with Ranger curled behind her again, his steady breath reminding her that memory was not always a sudden burst of light, sometimes it returned more like music remembered in fragments, a familiar chorus hummed under the breath. The town was called Hartley's Gap, though no one remembered who Hartley was anymore, and that Gap was little more than a bend in the road with a few clapboard houses and one narrow strip of businesses that hadn't changed in at least 30 years. The diner sat at the far end of the street, just past the post office and the faded barber shop, its neon sign still flickering the word open in pink and white, like a lighthouse that refused to give up even after the shoreline had changed. As they pulled into the gravel lot, the air carried the smell of fried potatoes, hot coffee, and something sweet that seemed to come from another time, a kind of comfort you could almost taste before you opened the door. Martha stepped out slowly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag like she was holding on to something more than just fabric, something invisible and trembling beneath the surface of memory. The bell above the diner door chimed softly, and the woman behind the counter, a tall figure with tired eyes and a name tag that read May, looked up from her crossword puzzle, squinting at Martha as though trying to place a face she almost knew but couldn't quite name. You're back, May said simply, not with drama or surprise, but with the matter-of-fact gentleness of someone who has seen grief return in many forms and decided long ago never to rush its arrival. Martha looked around slowly, her gaze scanning the red booths, the pie case, the faded jukebox in the corner, until she finally reached the far end of the diner, where the last booth by the window sat empty, except for a folded napkin placed carefully in the center of the table. She walked toward it slowly, every step ringing in her ears like the ticking of a long-stopped clock just beginning to move again. May came around the counter and stood beside her, wiping her hands on her apron with that soft anxiety older folks use when they're about to say something they've rehearsed in their heads for too many years. You came here 6 months ago, May said gently, her eyes flickering to Thomas before returning to Martha's. You were alone. Soaking wet. Looked like you'd walked for miles without knowing where you were going. You didn't know your name. Thomas remained silent, standing near the entrance with Ranger at his feet, his presence firm and grounding, like the page of a book that always waits for you to return, no matter how long you've been gone. Martha ran her hand over the table's surface, her fingertips brushing the napkin, still folded neatly, its edges weighted by something tucked underneath. She came in the next day, May continued, her voice thickening just a little now. She asked about you. Said she knew you might come here eventually. Told me to give you this if I ever saw you again. Martha unfolded the napkin slowly, her fingers moving with the same care someone might give to a fragile photograph or a pressed flower from a forgotten summer. Beneath it was a small envelope, no name on the front, just a wax seal with the letter E pressed into it. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the page inside, her eyes scanning the words not like someone reading, but like someone remembering. This was the last place you were yourself. You smiled at the jukebox and asked if they still had banana cream pie. You didn't know me. But I knew you. I didn't stop you from walking out, because I'd read somewhere that sometimes memory returns not through people, but through places. If you're reading this, then you came back. You followed the trail. And now it's time to go home. There's just one more thing you need to remember before you can understand why you left in the first place. Martha's hand fell to the table as she looked up slowly, her breath catching again in her chest, not from fear this time, but from the steady build of something that had been rising in her for days, like a storm gathering itself across the edges of a long horizon. There's more, she whispered, the words dry on her tongue. There's something I'm still not seeing. May placed a gentle hand on Martha's shoulder and nodded toward the wall beside the window, where a faded photograph hung in a chipped wooden frame. It showed two little girls standing on a beach, holding hands, their hair tied up with matching red ribbons, their eyes wide with sunlight and trust. One of the girls, the older one, wore a dress with a sunflower print, the same print Martha had seen in a quilt patch back in the attic. You gave me that photo, May said quietly. Said you didn't want to lose her again. Said it was the last day you remembered being happy before everything changed. Martha stepped closer, eyes locked on the picture, her breath slowing as her heart sped up, because the girl in the sunflower dress wasn't Evelyn. It was her. And the smaller child at her side, the one she'd sworn she never had a sister, was Evelyn, not yet given away, not yet separated. The truth bloomed behind her eyes so suddenly that she almost staggered from the weight of it, her mind remembering not just fragments or faces, but the terrible choice that had been made by someone long ago, a decision that had sent them into two different homes, two different lives, only to find each other again far too late. I lost her twice, Martha said aloud, the words like wind across glass. Once when they took her away, and again when I forgot. She turned back to Thomas, her eyes wide now, not with panic, but with clarity, as though she could finally see the shape of something that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. There's only one place left, she said, her voice slow but certain. The place where it all began. The house we lived in before everything changed. The one with the stone steps and the painted mailbox. Do you remember how to get there? Thomas had asked gently. And Martha, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, nodded before she even knew why. The road was narrow and uneven, shaded on both sides by towering elms that had grown together like old friends leaning into each other after weathering too many storms. Martha sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes locked not on the road ahead, but on something deeper within, the way someone listens to a song they've heard before, not in their ears, but in the rhythm of their soul. Ranger rode silently in the back seat, his head resting on the window ledge, his breath fogging the glass now and then, as if marking the places they'd passed through not just today, but across 1,000 quiet yesterdays. Thomas didn't speak much as he drove, which suited Martha just fine, because she had begun to hear things again, not with her ears, but with the part of her heart that had slowly been waking up, one name, one place, one scent at a time. They passed a rusted windmill, still creaking in the breeze like a metronome that had never quite stopped keeping time. A few turns later, the road turned gravel, and then narrowed into a path lined with low stone walls, some of them half fallen, others still upright with the same stubborn pride they'd had decades ago. Then, at the bend in the hill, the house came into view, not large, not grand, but unmistakably familiar in the way that only childhood homes can be, even when they've been forgotten and left behind. It was pale yellow, with peeling shutters and a porch swing that hung unevenly from chains grown rusty with age, and out front stood the old mailbox, bent slightly to the left, still painted blue, still decorated with little red flowers she remembered painting by hand one summer afternoon before the world changed. Thomas parked slowly and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved at first. They just sat there, watching the house through the windshield, as though afraid that opening the door might wake ghosts who'd been sleeping too peacefully to disturb. Martha finally stepped out and let the wind brush across her face, soft and cool and scented faintly with honeysuckle, earth, and memory. She walked up the stone path slowly, her footsteps crunching against time itself, her hand brushing the low bushes that had grown wild around the steps. At the door, her fingers hovered above the knob, but she didn't reach for it just yet. Instead, she turned to Thomas, her voice steady but hushed, like someone about to read aloud from a diary she'd once sworn she'd never open again. "This is where they took her," she said, her eyes misted but sharp now. "Social services came after our mother passed. I was 8. She was barely 3. I begged them not to separate us." Thomas said nothing, but his eyes never left her, and in them was a kind of reverence that only those who have waited, truly waited, can carry with grace. Martha turned the knob, the door creaking open to reveal dust particles spinning in the air like stars caught in morning light. The air smelled of old wood and forgotten rainstorms, but beneath that was something else, something floral and delicate, the lingering perfume of a childhood not fully erased. She walked slowly through the house, touching walls that once held family photos, peeking into rooms where voices once echoed, where Evelyn's little footsteps had once chased hers through hallways now too quiet. Then, in the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, she found it. The wallpaper was peeling, the crib long gone, but on the windowsill lay a single object, carefully placed, a wooden music box, shaped like a carousel, painted with chipped gold and soft blues. She picked it up gently, turned the key underneath, and listened as the faint melody filled the room. "You are my sunshine," a lullaby she hadn't heard in decades, and yet somehow remembered every word. "I sang this to her," Martha whispered, her voice catching now, tears trailing silently down her cheek. "She would only sleep when I sang it." Thomas stepped forward, placing something in her hand she hadn't noticed before, a folded piece of paper, soft with age, left by Evelyn, tucked beneath the carousel base. Martha opened it slowly, her breath hitching as she read the final piece of the trail, the truth Evelyn had left her to find only when she was ready. "You blamed yourself for losing me. But it wasn't your fault. They said we were too young to choose. But I chose you, every day. You spent your life trying to carry both our stories, and when it became too heavy, your mind did the only thing it could, it laid it down. I forgive you. I always did. It's time to come home now. And not just here. But all the way back to yourself." Martha let the paper fall softly to the floor and sank down beside the window, the music still playing in soft loops, the room glowing with late afternoon light. She looked over at Thomas, who stood in the doorway with Ranger sitting beside him like a sentry, calm and loyal. "I thought I was broken," she said slowly, "but I was just full. Too full." Thomas crossed the room, knelt beside her, and took her hand, his own rough from years of waiting, fixing, building things that would outlast the storms. "You were never broken," he said softly. "You just forgot how much you were carrying." They sat like that for a long while, the house no longer hollow but filled again, with memory, with forgiveness, with the soft breathing of two people who had weathered everything but still chose to sit beside each other in the quiet. Outside, the sky turned a deeper shade of gold, and the wind moved through the tall grass like the whisper of a name long buried but never gone. And in that moment, not before, not after, but exactly then, Martha remembered everything. Not just the pain or the loss or the faces. But the love. The love that had waited. The love that had guided her home. She looked out the window, the music box winding down, and asked softly, "Do you think it's too late to begin again? Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.